This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. It is now June, which means it is Pride Month. A few years ago, Sammy Felchenfeld was on episode 112, Celebrating Queer Cinema, where we talked about our favorite LGBT and Q+ films, which included stuff like The Kids Are Alright, Brokeback Mountain, Y Tu Mama Tambien, Tangerine, Priscilla Queen of the Desert, and more. One of my favorite podcasts is Bad Gay Movies, where each episode, Bil Antoniou, his co-host Daniel Krolik, and Michael Soulard, and a variety of guests talk about the best bad gay films. The podcast subtitle is Bitchy Gay Men, so it's always enjoyable listening to Bill and company dissect the nonsense of some not-so-great films. But as a fan of the show, I've always been curious about what gay-themed movies Bill actually loved, so I asked if he'd come on the podcast to talk about some good gay movies, trademark that. I also always wanted to be a guest on his show, but I don't think I quite fit the criteria, so I did the next best thing and asked him to be on to help recreate the magic. You last heard Bill on a few episodes ago on show 237, A24 Retrospective While We're Young. So welcome back, Bill. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. I actually do like to have a token straight man every once in a while on Bad Gay Movies. So, it's possible.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, keep that in mind, I guess. I know you also recently did an episode with your token female guest as well. So,
yes. Yeah, I like to have at least a token straight man and or token female on the show to go by the way we used to classify people back in my day. I think I've already shown my age by describing anyone as straight or female. So.
Well, when I approached you with the idea, I wanted your input on how to frame the episode and what movies to discuss. And we ended up going with movies that were important to you as a young gay man. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about Madonna, Truth or Dare, directed by Alex, I hope I say this right, Keshishian.
Yeah, Alec, not Alex. Yeah.
Alec Keshishian, a concert documentary following Madonna on her Blonde Ambition tour, combining on-stage performances at the height of her fame with behind-the-scenes access showing Madonna's personal relationships, tour life, and hanging out with her dancers. There's also Jeffrey, directed by Christopher Ashley, which is a comedy, I'm going to emphasize the comedy part, about a man who decides to give up having sex as he tries to navigate his dating life during the AIDS crisis. And Clueless, directed by Amy Heckerling, which is a modern retelling of Jane Austen's classic novel Emma, about a young girl who tries to play matchmaker but ignores people's actual feelings, including her own. These were all movies that came out between 1991 and 1995. Before we get into full discussions about these films, I'd love to know why these movies were impactful to you or how they shaped you as a gay man.
Wow, that's a big question. I think anyone who has ever come out in any variation of queer will tell you that it's not really a light switch where you suddenly realize, oh, I'm this, and then you make a decision of whether or not to tell people. It's kind of a process of erosion over time where, feelings exist, feelings grow, often in tandem with the feelings that come with, puberty and hormones sort of uploading into your body. And these kind of negotiations that you make in your mind of like, am I really this or am I just kind of this? The first time I felt what I thought was falling in love with a boy, it was just a boy I went to school with. And I was a boy too, just in case that sounds sketchy. I remember thinking like, oh, I'm quote unquote normal. It's just that he's the exception that I'm making to my otherwise sort of normal state because he's just so special, and I think that's a very common experience for a lot of people. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that you are coming into an awareness of yourself as something that the world in general doesn't have a good feeling about, especially back in my day. And I also grew up, my parents aren't super religious, but my mother comes from a very Christian Protestant family, and I grew up at a Christian school. I did consider myself a believer for a long time, although I've happily been an atheist for a very long time. So these are all things that are in the mix. And then, of course, you add to that popular culture and the way that it reinforces what you're feeling, challenges what you're feeling, comforts what you're feeling in many ways. And so I'm sure that if I went through the list of everything that had an impact on me, it would be a very, very, very long list. But these are the three films that come closest or quickest to mind, partly because they're all films that I've seen many times. I rewatched them all this week in preparation for this, and I found myself thinking, why am I rewatching these? I know all of these entirely off by heart. My friend Chrissy, hi Chrissy, and I used to recite Madonna's Truth or Dare to each other in full on the phone all the time. So, so basically, I mean, we'll get into it in detail, but you have one film that breaks through in terms of the way gay characters are presented in teen movies in a really significant way. You have a film in which there are real gay men who terrified and excited me. And then you have this lovely comedy in which the world of being a gay man is so colorful and appealing and romantic and sexy that I mean, after I saw Jeffrey, I came out because it just made it seem so appealing to me.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Yeah. I was obviously, watching these three movies and trying to piece together what parts of the essence of Bil do they speak to. And so it was very interesting to sort of look at them because, like you were saying, sort of explicitly, Jeffrey is the only one of the three that the central tenet of the story is about a gay character, whereas the other two have gay characters on the periphery, more so on the periphery of Clueless, where it's sort of a subplot, whereas Madonna, it's, the whole culture is sort of infused into that movie. So it's sort of interesting to see these three wildly different movies in how they might have been impactful for you. It was something very interesting to watch and sort of keep that in the back of my mind.
Well, gay characters on the periphery is all I knew to expect. And I think it's all that anyone of my generation and before knew to expect. And I think because you're like a decade behind me. So my best friend's wedding comes out when I'm 20, which is around the same time as like Ellen comes out, and then Will and Grace is a minute later. And then the culture changes completely. And so I think you're not as used to the world before that as I was. Like, I actually came of age in the world before that, where to see a gay character who wasn't made fun of, killed off, or I mean, sometimes they could be killed off maybe in a way that wasn't so negative, but who was not the butt of the joke and who was not presented as a failure of society or something that was interrupting the way good people live, which is how I was raised to see. Like, generally you would wince every time you found out a character was gay because you were preparing yourself for being insulted or hurt in some way. And when you weren't, I think you gave films a lot more credit than they necessarily deserved because of that, because you were just so used to it being a negative experience. So it's not really that surprising that my choices are all, or for the most part, characters where it's in the periphery. Because don't forget, these two of them are mainstream films that are seen by everybody. And then within them, you have gay characters being presented in illegitimate light and in a way that makes more of a difference than an independent film that's only going to preach to the converted.
Yeah, and I sort of realized that afterwards because Jeffrey, as we're going to get into, really did feel like it was, living in this independent world, despite the fact that it had, some very notable stars in it, mainly Patrick Stewart as the second lead in it. Yeah. But it was absolutely fascinating to sort of see because it really sort of felt like a movie similar to But I'm a Cheerleader or something like that where you're really playing up the campiness to be like, hey, we're super low budget, we know that, but we're going to make this as enjoyable as possible, even if you sort of notice the cracks in the seams of the literal sets we've built. Yeah.
Yeah, and by the time the era of But I'm a Cheerleader is when you have the independent movement in full swing. So you do have a lot of big actors appearing in projects like that all the time. And also I remember going to the theater and seeing small independent gay movies all the time in the early 2000s. Jeffrey is kind of ahead of that curve coming out in 1995.
People think that being a star is about being fabulous, being in the spotlight, having your picture taken all the time and having everyone worship and adore you. Being rich, rich, rich. Having it all. And you know what? They're absolutely right.
I'm so desperate.
For what, honey?
For some fun.
Well, I'd love to get started with the first one, Madonna, Truth or Dare. I'm going to just go in chronological order of when they came out. This one did come out in 1991. And so as I said at the top, it's a concert documentary. Everyone has seen concert documentaries a million times, so they sort of know the format. You know, you kind of got two different types of concert documentaries. One where it's exclusively about the music, and one that sort of shows the backstage, the preparation, everything that goes into it. And sort of this movie is very interestingly combines both of it. Something I find is more and more rare because it seems to be one or the other these days.
Yeah.
And it was beautifully shot where the concert performances were all in color, and then all the backstage stuff outside of the live performances was black and white. Yeah. It's got this real nice film grain to it. And so it's very interesting to watch. So I'm curious about like the first time you watched this and how it hit you. I assume you were already a Madonna fan when you watched it for the first time?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I always liked her, even though because my first Madonna video I saw when I was like 6 years old. She's been in my life, my whole life. Although Cyndi Lauper was my favorite when I was really little. Which is as gay as it gets. But by the time of like the True Blue Papa Don't Preach era is when Madonna just became the coolest person in the world to me. And then, of course, Truth or Dare is the Blonde Ambition show. That's like Vogue, Dick Tracy. That's peak Madonna, basically. This is her at the very, very height of her powers. She is literally the most famous person in the world. And so, of course, this movie comes out, and I wasn't going to miss it to save my life. And I still remember that night extremely well. It was June of 1991. I was going to turn 14 a month later. I remember it all. We went to Fairview Mall Theater to see it. And I was so excited, and I loved every second of it. And then I bought the video cassette and I watched it 100 billion times. And then since then, I think I bought it on Laserdisc as well. And now I have it on Blu-ray. And watching it this week, I hadn't seen it in a long time, but it's all there, the whole thing. If I'm ever like trapped in, like prison for hundreds of years and I'm not allowed to watch anything, I can just play Truth or Dare in my mind from beginning to end and not miss a moment of it. And it was a culture shock thing for me, because, well, first of all, actually, you talked about various kinds of concert films. So she actually hired Alec Kashishian based on, I think, he had made like a college film that she liked, probably because she felt she could get him cheap. She hired him to actually film the concert itself. And then at some point got the idea to also like capture a few things backstage. And she just liked what he was filming so much that she decided to make that the film, which of course kind of came to bite her in the ass when there were lawsuits involved from people, 3 of her dancers and other people have had things to say about it because they were basically told that they were being filmed for diary purposes and not for this major motion picture. But they all signed releases. So, you know, whatever. So the effect it had on me, particularly when it comes to the dancers, I mean, I was 14. These guys, I'm only realizing now watching it again, how young they were. They're all like 21 years old. And of course, to me at 14, they all seemed like full grown adults, you know, they terrified me. I mean, they were so catty and mean in a way that I, at that age, you know, being a suburban kid who had grown up at a Christian school, I didn't really understand the camaraderie of that the way that I would later on, and the way that I would become later on. And so there's something unapologetic and ripe about them. And that's something that Madonna really wanted to showcase, even to the point of going against their own wishes. I mean, one of the dancers who sued her was because he asked her not to include that very famous scene of the 2 dancers kissing. And she refused. She's like, you signed the waiver and I don't have to do what you want. And he has since passed away. And his mother still has things to say about Madonna for it. But you know, that made an impression. I mean, I still remember that scene in the theater when people started screaming, and I mean, screaming when they saw that. And I don't remember feeling one way or the other about it, just because I think I was just so uncomfortable by the reaction to it. And so, yeah, it just, the way that she had these men front and center as something exciting. I don't know that she was presenting it as sort of like legitimate people in a legitimate world, because they're dancers on a concert tour. You know, I'm not seeing them living their happy, normal lives, but it was really tantalizing to me, but it did not connect with me at all in terms of how I felt about myself or where where I was at that point in my development of my self-awareness.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I this was an interesting movie for me to watch. I never was a big Madonna fan, but watching this, I really appreciated her live performances because I thought they were all absolutely incredible. They were captured very vividly.
It's the best thing about her career. Like, if anyone wants to take pot shots at Madonna for anything else, her voice, her songwriting, her acting, fair, but like no one does a live show better than she does. And I find that even when I show her concerts to people who don't like her at all, they still love them. Like, there's just and it's her having a good time. Like, she has an energy when she's performing live that really translates to the audience. And it still seems that way. Like, even now, all these years later, I still find that whatever else you can say about her, and I know she gets criticism for the way she looks now and all that stuff, but you get her up on that stage and she, as she herself says, I still feel lifted up off my feet whenever I'm performing live. So.
Yeah, I think for me, the issue with the movie was more so the behind the scenes stuff. It really felt like Madonna was basically doing a performance of what we would think a normal person
for sure
would act like.
Well, there are parts of this documentary that I would bet my money are completely staged. I know people like her brother has said that certain parts are staged. I'm sure they are. I don't think that phone call with her dad is everything you think it is. She definitely has a narrative in mind, and that's okay. The thing that a lot of people who criticize Madonna don't realize, that her fans don't need you to tell them that she's full of shit, because that's kind of what we like about her. Like, the fact that she's kind of a bitch and a brat and full of shit is part of the appeal. So don't think that you're like, tearing apart our notions of her by revealing that. And finding out the parts of this movie aren't, full verite doesn't ruin it for me in any way.
I had an old boss of mine. He was the biggest Madonna fan. Every time she had a new album come out, he would buy multiple copies of it on different formats. He had it on vinyl, on CD, I'm sure he has it on cassette as well, if that was possible. And like, when there would be different versions. So like, I would try to poke fun at him about Madonna and stuff like that, and he would just be like, I don't care. Yeah. Like, there's literally nothing you could say that will insult me about this.
It's something that she sort of cultivates herself in the way she presents her image and whatever. It's just like, needing approval is not part of the formula with her. Yeah.
But I thought we're talking about the sort of the clickiness of the dancers in that aspect. I thought it was definitely really funny where Madonna had to repeatedly ask the dancers to stop bullying the only straight dancer of the group.
Who was only like 18. That shocked me too when I realized that. So I don't know if I'm sure you know, a few years ago, there's a documentary that came out called Strike a Pose, which is catching up with 6 of the 7 dancers 25 years later, and just sort of their highs and lows in between. And Oliver is the one straight guy who talks about, the world that was opened up to him by these guys. He comes there, this really young guy, very tough, from New Orleans, very homophobic and whatever, and that these guys became his family and sort of expanded his world in that way. He's focused on a lot in the movie just because I think that's the narrative that she decided was the most interesting of all the dancers. Also, fun fact, her brother in his book says that Madonna always makes sure that at least one of the dancers is straight. No reason for the entirety of the tour. So, which I find interesting, and could just imagine what went on. But it was interesting I'd never seen Strike a Pose before I watched it this week. Also, in preparation for this, I figured I should finally get around to it. And it is interesting to see, these guys didn't seem to realize that Madonna is a business. She's not a person. And so whatever betrayal they felt, especially the 3 of them who brought a lawsuit against her. And then I think they thought that she would react the way a friend would in trying to resolve everything, but actually she reacted like a corporation, which was basically to say, this is what you signed, this is what the rule is, and this is what my rights are. And then I think they all received a settlement, an undisclosed settlement, and then, were cut off from her for life. And watching the documentary, seeing them talking about her 25 years later, it does still seem to be that they don't realize that she is a business and not a person, to the point that she doesn't even, like, Kevin Stay is the most successful of all of them in terms of what he's done since that movie. And he was one of the ones who brought a suit against her, and she never spoke to him again. but she also never like blacklisted him. She didn't, tell anybody else not to work with him. He went on to great success because she's that impersonal that she's not even doing you dirty,
Yeah.
So,
I do want to touch on the homophobia aspect of this movie. There's a couple scenes in particular. And I think these days, especially, I think everyone sort of perks up when they hear the F word being dropped very casually. And this movie, specifically one of the dancers talks about the other dancers in that manner. Yeah. But then you also hear Madonna as well. And I found a really interesting article that's called Examining the Politics of Madonna's Truth or Dare 30 Years Later. And I'm just going to read this one little paragraph here. For one, the movie is riddled with gay slurs. It's impossible not to flinch now, watching Madonna drop so many F-bombs. At one point, she tells one of her dancers, I wouldn't hire fags that hate women. I kill fags that hate women. In fact, I kill anyone who hates women. Cringeworthy though it is, the scene is a reflection of the 90s as a period of reclaiming historically hostile language and a reminder that allies at the time were permitted to do the same. By the end of the decade, even the ladies of Sex and the City were using the other F word.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with Gen Z. I can promise you that secretly, when straight people aren't around, we're all using that word with each other. When none of you, baristas with humanities degrees who can't get a job and need to police everyone else's language are around, we call each other whatever we want. But it's important to remember that Madonna was like openly hanging out with gay men at a time when that was not nearly the cultural cachet that it is now, and in fact was probably something she was warned against doing. Madonna was also openly, is fraternizing the right word? I mean, she was battling AIDSophobia basically by being seen with people who were HIV positive and not being afraid to be physically in contact with them and all that stuff. And then her tour had this very, very heavy messaging about raising awareness about AIDS and HIV, which was a lot thornier back then than it is now, and got her into more hot water than it would now that we don't really remember. So there's a lot of context that you need if there is, scenes in that movie that rub you the wrong way. I completely forget about it because I've seen it so many times and I remember it in its context. So that stuff doesn't make an impression on me. Also, I have no soul, so.
Yeah, and I think the key aspect is reclaiming historically hostile language in that paragraph. In the same way other marginalized groups will use, slurs amongst themselves, but not in a pejorative way.
Yeah, I don't find that that's a really helpful conversation, though, only because everyone has their own opinions on it. And everyone will always have their own opinions on whether or not you're reclaiming language in a way that's constructive or suggestive or helpful in any way. I just know that no one was ever going to mistake Madonna for a homophobe. Blind dead people would not mistake Madonna for a homophobe. So, just the visibility of them in that movie is so groundbreaking in a way that was just not happening. I mean, this movie comes out the same year as Fried Green Tomatoes, where you have these two women who are clearly in a relationship, and the lengths that movie goes to avoid talking about it is hilariously funny. And I say that as someone who loves that movie, but it was not polite to talk about.
And sort of on the flip side of, if people find an issue with the language, Madonna also includes a scene of the Gay Pride Parade march at a time when the Gay Pride Parade is not what it is today, where, people bring their kids. It's a huge family affair and, all the corporate sponsors are there and all that sort of stuff. It really still was at that time very much a protest march.
And very much with the messaging about AIDS and everything political around that being very prevalent in the parade as well, because she shows the moment of a moment of silence, right?
Yeah, and it's her dancers that are there attending the parade, and you see them visibly in tears watching, all the floats go by, not really floats, but all the people marching by, and the impact that probably had at the time.
I don't even know if I knew that there was such thing as a gay pride parade when I saw that movie, and I'm sure that that's the truth for a lot of people who saw that film. I mean, I saw that movie at a shopping mall in the suburbs. It's a big deal that a movie with the content that it has played as wide as it did. And a lot of that's because of her. Madonna gets a lot of crap for cultural appropriation, the way she co-opts ballroom dance culture, into Vogue and all that stuff. But the truth is, she opened up a lot of our worlds, and in her version of it, used her celebrity for good. I mean, I got an English degree because of Madonna. So, she definitely affected my life in more positive ways than negative. That's for sure.
There you go. Yeah. Speaking of the ballroom culture, it's interesting. I only watched Paris is Burning a few years ago, and now having that in my mind because it's such an amazing documentary. Seeing this and just being like, oh yeah, it's absolutely where Madonna got her entire image from, basically.
Yeah, for that period. Yeah, I mean, and those movies both come out the same year. I actually didn't see Paris is Burning for the first time until like last year or the year before. But they were two of the. I mean, I think Paris is Burning was 9 or 10 on the critics' best list of the year, and Truth or Dare was right after it. They were both highly acclaimed. Truth or Dare, of course, made a ton of money. It was the most successful documentary of all time until Bowling for Columbine. So, it was a big deal, which is also what inspired lawsuits, was the fact that it made so much money.
It made money. Yeah. It's definitely interesting watching this movie through today's lens. And I'm not talking about the language. It's more talking about, the general acceptance that, most of, North America has made towards the gay community in the last 30 plus years, almost, and how this just seems so quaint to me. Like, oh yeah, she's just hanging out with their dancers and, they're playing silly drinking games and stuff like that. But realizing how just literally ground shaking, earth shattering several of these scenes were, especially, when showing two dancers making out and
it's a really sexy kiss too. Yeah. And also making Truth or Dare popular. I mean, who plays that game after the age of 12? But anyway, and I'm sure that was her saying, I don't think Madonna actually had that much time to hang around with her dancers. So I'm pretty sure that she was like, all right, everyone, we're filming today and this is what we're going to do. But, also something that, is more connected to today is the fact that the identity of these dancers, the fact that you have a lot of like Black and Latino from New York, like gay, when gay made it into popular culture for a long time, it was always white and suburban. So is the case with my other two selections, and most of the movies that sort of pierced the culture around that time would have been the same. And I think it is also worth pointing out that Madonna has, guys who basically look like the cast members of Pose or something like that, something that we associate more with an opening up of representation now than would have been had at the time.
Yeah, I quite enjoy this movie, despite the fact that I have faults with the Madonna cult of personality aspect of it.
Well, this is her at her brattiest too. Although I much prefer this Madonna to Wise Madonna, because that's also a construct. Like Madonna sharing her Kabbalah wisdom with us. It's also a construct and it's a bit of a pill. I prefer her just being shitty to everybody because she's better than everybody. Because she is. There's Madonna and there's everybody else. That's the rule.
Yeah. It really does feel like she's a child, like a literal child in this movie, despite the fact that she's, I think, 30 or 31 years old at the time of this tour. And, she's hanging out with a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds. Yeah. And she's the one acting like a child.
Yeah. And also saying things like they fulfilled the need in me to be mothered and all that stuff. It's like, oh, good Lord. I mean, I rolled my eyes watching this movie now much more than I ever did before, but I adore it. And also, this is the thing about celebs that we loved when we were kids. You watch them at their high point and you remember being that young too. And it makes you wistful for when, I loved my life when Madonna was all I thought about. I kind of miss that being the biggest thing that I had to think about and talk about.
And as ridiculous as the concept of Madonna wanting to be a mother to all these dancers, I would not be shocked if several of the dancers probably felt, maybe for one of the first times in their lives, a familial aspect, because they could be themselves and not have to worry about, what their disapproving family members feel, or if their other employers found out if they were gay.
And also they're dancers, and dancers spend their lives being disapproved of. You're always at a cattle call with a million other people. You're almost always getting cut. So when you do get chosen, you do feel special, and they are very young. And Madonna's dazzling, and she's already extremely famous. So it's not like they're coming up with her that they become famous all together, right? So of course they feel, again, they mistake her for a person as opposed to a business. And I'm sure that what affection she gave them was real, But I think Madonna is one of those people where she means it at the time. But when she's ready to move on, she's ready to move on. And it's interesting in Strike a Pose, one of the dancers, Lewis, is the only one who at the end says, you know what, guys? She doesn't owe us anything. She gave us this opportunity and we did with it whatever we did, good or bad. And this is a guy who's been through rehab. And I have a feeling he went through a lot of stages of finding his own inner peace in order to come to terms with whatever he felt he was owed versus whatever, he was given and what he deserved, all that stuff. So I find that also very interesting.
Jeffrey, you are being ridiculous.
Can you tell if you're having a nervous breakdown?
This sex thing has got completely out of hand.
Dad, I've stopped having sex.
Jeff stopped having sex.
No sex? You mean just safe sex?
My dear, what you need is a relationship.
Relationship? And shoes.
Well, speaking of moving on, I think, we spent enough time talking about Madonna, and I would love to talk about Jeffrey. And as I said in the intro, emphasis on the comedy about AIDS. And, once again, much like how I was saying the Madonna movie might seem quaint now, I feel like something like this would be quite quaint now as well. Yeah. But I'm sure in 1995, this was also pretty earth-shattering of, you're not supposed to, make light of AIDS. People are literally dying of this. And of course, they do finally sort of address the emotional root to this movie near the end and when everything kind of comes crashing down around Jeffrey's world. But, so much about this movie is literally laugh out loud, hilarious, campy, over the top. There's so much also I see of that we see in drag race culture coming from movies like this too. The style, the look, the feel, all that campiness is there.
Yeah, because it's Paul Rudnick, who is just the most wonderful writer. He went on to have a much bigger hit with In and Out 2 years ago, which he wrote. He also wrote Addams Family Values, which is the funnier of the two Addams Family movies. He was just hysterical. And then if you've ever read his movie reviews for Premiere Magazine, which he wrote under the pseudonym of Libby Gelman Waxner, they are also hysterically funny. My favorite observation of his that Tom Cruise in Interview with a Vampire looked like Sarah Jessica Parker after she'd taken off a knitted hat.
Oh my
God. So yeah, I love Jeffrey. At the time, I remember renting it and watching it, and I knew why I wanted to see it. I mean, emotionally, instinctively, I knew why I wanted to see it. But I think the first time I watched it, consciously, I was thinking about just how wonderfully funny it was. Because regardless of whether or not I knew I was gay, I did know that I loved that kind of backhanded humor. The sort of meta-ness of it, the talking to the audience, is something that doesn't quite work for me as well now. That's a very 90s indie movie thing. But everything else about it, I just adored. I liked its flippancy. And I love the idea of treating a very serious subject with humor without undercutting the seriousness of the subject. Because that's just very human to me. Because in real life, that's how we get through everything traumatic about life, basically, is to try not to take it too seriously, or try not to take ourselves too seriously while taking the real problem seriously, basically.
It almost sort of felt like, if I imagine a lot of people, if they're listening to this episode, they probably have watched Sex and the City. It reminded me of the first few episodes of Sex and the City where they would do this sort of cut to people that Carrie was writing about, and they would give a direct address to the camera sort of thing. And that's what this movie really felt like to me. There's
a whole world of New York humor about that from that time. Sex and the City premieres only 3 years after this, right? So, it's very much of its time. And then you have the cast as well. The whole cast is like famous New York actors. Patrick Stewart is the only one of the famous people who has like a major role. Everybody else, and obviously Steven Weber, because he would have already been on TV. Everyone else is like a famous New York actor who had a day, basically, to spare.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like, I'm just going to quickly run through some of the names in this movie. You've got Christine Baranski, Victor Garber, Brian Batt, Cameron Manheim, Sigourney Weaver, Kathy Najimy. Who else we
Jerry
got here?
From
Nathan
Succession,
Lane.
J. Smith Cameron.
Oh yeah, Olympia Dukakis, Kevin Nealon, and then even more. You have stand-up comedian Jeffrey Ross, who clearly was not famous at this time, was basically playing man number 2 in the movie theater or whatever his character's name was.
That's right.
But still quite an impressive cast.
Yeah.
It really sort of felt like this was director Christopher Ashley being like, hey, all my fellow acting friends, can you come and do a day on my movie?
Yeah, or they knew Paul Rudnick because he's already an established Broadway writer. I mean, the play had already been on Broadway, and he'd also, I think it's called I Hate Hamlet. He had that play before that. So the New York theater people would have already known them. And this is a rare case of Sigourney being attached to her sort of New York theater, that side of her, which is like the major side of her, although we know her as a glamorous movie star. And I'm pretty sure she shot that whole thing in one day as well. And she's so great. I love Deborah. I love that whole thing. And I had the pleasure of doing this play 12 years later, and I played the Patrick Stewart part. They wouldn't give it to me because I was too young, but I begged. And then the guy they had in mind dropped out, so I got to play that. And I had a wonderful time. That's actually how I met Daniel Krolik, was doing Jeffrey.
Oh, yeah, wow. Interesting.
He played the Nathan Lane part.
Oh, yeah. That's funny. I can definitely see the two of you in those roles.
Yes, absolutely. No, we were great, actually. I will not tell a lie. And there's one particular scene that is also in the film that I love watching, because I remember having sort of one of those breakthrough moments where you figure out acting, where you just, or like where something you learned in class finally sinks in and you figure it out. And I remember having that kind of breakthrough doing that show. And that felt great. There's also a small performance by David Thornton, who is Cyndi Lauper's husband, who is one of the guys at the beginning that he's in bed with, who wants his like entire medical history.
Oh, yeah, that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want the apartment or not? Yeah, that was a great line.
And also that wonderful cutaway, that hilarious cutaway where, they kiss in the gym, and then it cuts away to, in theory, two couples watching the movie in a movie theater, and the guy's like making vomiting noises while the girls think it's awe. I remember that happening all the time. That's also something that people would not believe now, because it would never happen now, because we're all like watching everyone fist each other on TV and in movies and all that stuff. But in the 90s, I would go to the movies and there would hardly be any kind of action, and guys would audibly start making gross out noises in the theater, just because they needed to make sure that we knew that, they weren't into this, and that if they were there with girls, they needed to make sure their girlfriends didn't think they were the least bit gay. And I remember seeing that movie, The Object of My Affection, with Jennifer Aniston. And these guys made that noise during that movie. I think because the boys kiss, or they're just in bed together. And this adorable little like 12-year-old girl was sitting near me. She wasn't with me. And she had like pigtails, just delightful. And she just screamed, "Oh, grow up," when they started, to these grown men. And I don't know who that girl was. I still think of her, and I still love her dearly. And not long after, my friend and I went to see Go, where Scott Wolf and Jay Moore don't even kiss in that movie. And guys started making noise during that, and inspired by that girl of before. And my friend just screamed, "Oh, grow up," even though we were much older. And so, yeah. So that's, to give you an idea of the culture of the time, and the reason why certain movies meant something to me, given what I was dealing with in daily life.
Yeah, it's interesting because I watched Jeffrey first of all these movies, and when that scene happened, obviously it's a funny scene. But when watching Truth or Dare, when the two dancers are making out, I was picturing, I was like, I bet you literally in the audience that cut scene from Jeffrey is happening at this exact moment.
I don't even remember knowing what the noise was. I remember people screaming. Like, I remember girls screaming. I don't remember. I'm sure there were guys who made gross out noises too. It was like that, when you have that feeling where the blood rushes to your ears and you can't hear anything. That's how it was for me. Probably because I was having a reaction to it that I wasn't articulating to myself.
I'd like to kind of talk about the fact that the two main actors in this movie, Steven Weber and Patrick Stewart, are, of course, they're straight men in real life, both playing gay actors. Whereas, you also have Brian Batt, who is playing Patrick Stewart's partner in this, is a gay man, whom most people probably know from Mad Men as what was his name? Sal. He was the graphic designer for them.
I think he's the only one too. I think Michael T. Weiss is straight in real life too.
I believe so as well. I forgot to look that up, but I think I saw something about that. So yeah, I'm sort of curious about how that sort of plays out, where this is, such a queer film with, obviously at the time it's only been in the last 5 years that people have actually started caring about hiring actual queer actors to play queer roles.
Well, it's also because it's only until recently that queer actors are willing to play queer roles. That's not really a popular thing, I'm supposed to say. It didn't, it was known and noted on at the time, because I remember talking about these things with my friends. I'm a little bit older when this movie comes out. I'm 18, so I'm, again, this movie made me come out, and then I had a lot more friends and blah, blah, blah. It wasn't a controversial topic because the idea was that you had a famous person putting themselves on the line by appearing in something with this subject matter. And that was the thing that made an impression. And when it came to famous people, like people who could sell a movie, you didn't really have a choice other than straight people, mostly white people. So thankfully, that's what's changed, which is that you have someone like Matt Bomer nowadays. And so you have an option. Because ultimately, casting, unfortunately, is never about who is most right for the part. It's just about people believing that they're going to be able to sell the movie based on who's in it, and they don't really care about anything else. So it's sort of in a way, it's up to audiences to make more than just straight white men famous, which is a lot to ask. But so yeah, that's something that makes more of an impression on people watching it now. At the time, I just remember loving it because I think Steven Weber is a snack and a half. So, and also he's a New York actor and he knows this world extremely well. So he doesn't play it like a straight guy congratulating himself on his open-mindedness. He plays Jeffrey's vulnerability exceptionally well. I have no trouble believing him in this role at all. I think Michael T. Weiss is more of like a gay man's fantasy of a straight guy who's actually gay, although he's good. While as Steven Weber is like, he's absolutely the real deal. And also, unpopular opinion, some people are just better actors than other people. Some people are better at recreating a human experience than other people, regardless of whatever their background is. I also think of this when I think of Eric McCormack on Will and Grace, because I just have a hard time imagining other actors being as good in that role as he was. However, there is something to be said for the market of acting and the fact that, so many gay men pay the same tuition at acting school and go through all the paces and then find that they're not able to get hired. And then when there are the few roles that they would be considered for, they go to people who aren't, who don't have that qualification. So the controversy over it is completely understandable. But on a pure, on a pure principle point of view, I would like to think that any actor who is good enough can play any role, but this is also something that people have to make a living at, and that's where the differences come in.
Yeah, totally understand that one. I sort of appreciate it in this movie how we also get a wide cross section of queer lifestyles, because so often, in movies, there's only one gay character, and so they inevitably become sort of stereotype in and of themselves. But as we get more of these expansive ensemble type pieces where there are multiple queer people, then that allows room. Yes, you can have one character who might seem on the surface a little more stereotypical, but you also have a wide variety of other characters as well, so it sort of balances itself out. And I really appreciate that about this movie is we really get to see a wide variety of different kinds of men, and why you understand maybe the idea that I think a lot of small-minded people might be like, oh, two men are gay, so they must be attracted to each other. Well, no, we have nothing in common. We're not alike at all. This isn't who I'm into normally, all that sort of stuff. And here we get that spectrum.
Yeah, and also the fun of people who are stereotypes and are more than just their stereotype. I mean, Patrick Stewart's character he's an interior decorator, which is sort of stock gay character number one. He loves being an interior decorator, and he loves the joke of his being a joke, but then he's also so much more beyond that. The same with Darius being a Broadway dancer who is in Cats of all things. And then Jeffrey is presented as he's very, like with his varsity jackets and whatever, he's very preppy. It's part of the character's being in hiding, basically, which is that he's hiding from the modern world, and his being a bit vanilla is the result of that. And then, of course, Steve is the Jim Bunny stereotype. And Paul Rudnick just basically wants to say, you're relegating us to these stereotypes isn't what's offensive. It's the fact that you don't let us also be people at the same time. Because these stereotypes exist for a reason. It's also a time, this is part of the film's AIDS activism, is that people were writing AIDS off as something that only happened to a certain kind of person. And the fight back is, this certain kind of person doesn't deserve to die just because you don't take their life seriously, or that you don't hang out with these kinds of people. And, and I remember a lot of conversations about AIDS being like, oh, it's so sad when a child gets it from a blood transfusion. It's like, no, it's also sad when someone gets it from having sex. Like, having sex is not something that people deserve to be condemned for. All of us have sex. Well, most of us. A lot of people have sex. And a lot of people make mistakes or don't when it comes to having sex. Neither of those things deserve to end in death, you know? And so I think that's also something that the film is in some way addressing without being too heavy-handed about it.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I'm sort of curious about, you know, I feel like the height of the AIDS crisis from what I saw was more of like the late 80s sort of thing. And it sort of portrays it as, I don't want to call it a new thing, but it definitely sort of feels like it's more of a fresh disease that's being spread in 1995 rather than, in my opinion, I'm thinking like, you know, the George Bush administration of like 1988 sort of
Well,
thing.
he wrote the play earlier, don't forget. The play, if the movie comes out in 95, the play was probably in 93. What he's actually talking about even more is the way in which the culture, by the mid 90s is when AIDS activism, like fundraisers and celebrities with their red ribbons, becomes a really big deal. And the sort of cultural shift in the way that it exists in society versus in the 80s. And this is something that I remember from when I was young. So if someone's going to, you know, contradict how I remember it, that's totally fair. I remember the late 80s being much more fear. Like, I remember being a kid and people not knowing how it spread and, oh, I heard you can get it from toilet seats, blah, blah, blah. By the time I'm entering high school, I remember knowing everything about how to get it, how to avoid it, all that stuff. But it's still incurable, right? And so that's when you have, you know, the prevalence of Elizabeth Taylor and then Madonna, Sharon Stone, a bit later, all these famous people who are taking part in celebrity fundraisers. This is something that's poked fun at in Jeffrey with Christine Baranski and the Hoedown for AIDS that she hosts.
Oh, I love that
And
quote.
I feel like that culture, particularly New York City having been completely ravaged by the disease, and especially the Broadway, like the theater community, in the 80s. And then all of a sudden we're dealing with it with all these like glamorous fundraisers where I'm sure people had cynical ideas of just how much funds were being raised. So I think that that's a lot of the impetus for the background of this movie.
And sort of much like Truth or Dare, this also, you know, features a sequence taking place during a pride parade. And I sort of like how they're able to poke fun of all the different sort of groups of queer people that attend this, including the best line of when they're doing the roll call of the gay black Republicans, and then you literally hear tumbleweeds.
There's no one there. Funny enough.
Yeah.
That's changed since then.
I will never for the life of me understand log cabin Republicans. It makes zero sense.
I don't know. I try my best to pretend that American politics don't exist, but it's hard to avoid. Yeah.
It is, yes. But either way, it was nice, and you get that great scene with Olympia Dukakis and her son. Oh, sorry, her daughter.
Angelique, is that her name? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, which, I mean, the terminology happening in that scene is something that wouldn't fly today, but that's part of why it's funny, is because she's so offensive while being so loving and supportive of her daughter. And it's also, I mean, it's just Olympia Dukakis again with the data spent on this film, and she's hysterical.
Yeah. And I think that it sort of kind of goes back to the Madonna aspect of, you know, being an ally at the time. It's sort of a different set of rules for what the rest of the general public, whereas she's not using the terminology to be cruel or mean. She's doing it in a more of an endearing sort of way.
Well, I mean, and also the way we position these things in greater society has changed over time. You know, the way people who are outside of whatever it is that society calls normal. I don't know what that is. Anyone who falls under queer. I mean, the way that they interact with popular culture and whatever you consider mainstream society to be, that's changed over time. So the ways in which we talk about it is going to change, and the acceptable ways to talk about it is going to change as well.
Mr. Hall was way harsh. He gave me a C-.
Well, he gave me a C, which drags down my entire average.
Hello? There was a stop sign?
I totally paused. You try driving in platforms.
Oh, should I write them a note? Ew! Get off
me. As if. Cher's got attitude about high school boys. It's a personal choice every woman has got to make for themselves. Cher's saving herself for Luke Perry.
Cher, you're a virgin?
I mean, I'm not prude. I'm just highly selective. I mean, you see how picky I am about my shoes, and they only go on my feet.
All right, let us move on to the last movie of the bunch, and that is Clueless, directed by Amy Heckerling from 1995 as well, which definitely, of the three, is the most well-known, most famous, probably just about everyone has seen that. And obviously, I think, the biggest crime is the fact that Amy Heckerling has probably directed two of the most influential teen movies of one of the 80s and one in the 90s, and struggled to get feature film work afterward. Obviously, she's had a long career in television.
She struggled to make anything good since, too. I liked that movie Loser that she made with Mina Suvari. I enjoyed that film, but everything else, I mean, that one with Michelle Pfeiffer is terrible, and her vampire comedy is terrible as well. She also had Look Who's Talking as well, which was a big hit for her as well. But, if I made one movie as good as Clueless, I would die a happy man. It's the Gone with the Wind of teen movies for me. It's so good. It helps that I was 18 when it came out. So, of course, it speaks directly to me, although that's part of the movie's skill because it is about, cushy Beverly Hills teenagers. So why does it speak to me? I have nothing to do with these people. And yet, she adapts Jane Austen so incredibly well without being in any way exact, obviously, because she adapts it to modern times. I did a Jane Austen course in university, and our professor, who is now a very good friend of mine, showed us Clueless on our very last class because she considered it the best Jane Austen adaptation.
Yeah, I've often heard that from other, English majors as well. So it's sort of shocking that, you can transport a classic source material and update it to the modern world and it have the exact same impact it would have had at its release too, but be able to speak to the intended target audience.
Yeah, and because this movie was successful, everyone else tried to do it after. So you had like 10 Things I Hate About You, and I think there's that one with Kirsten Dunst that's based on Midsummer Night's Dream. And
then there's like, the Othello version.
So there's a million of these movies after, and some of them are charming. Nothing can beat Clueless. One of the things she does exceptionally well, which is truly showing her skill, is that she also adapts the tone the same, which is that in Emma, Jane Austen is teasing at how hopeless Emma Woodhouse is, but she also adores her at the same time. And that's something that you have in Clueless as well, which is that she's not afraid to show the airheaded qualities of Cher, but she's also a very endearing character. She's not ignorant. She's just a product of her world and of her culture, but she's actually in her version of it thoughtful and well-intentioned and just clueless, basically. And you have this magnificent performance by Alicia Silverstone in the lead, who apparently, bore a lot of the qualities of the character. Like, she actually thought it was pronounced Haitians, and Amy Heckerling told the crew, don't correct her, because I want her to say it in this incredibly guileless way that she says it in that scene.
Yes. And so sort of, this one, I was the most curious about why you had picked it originally. And I think when you were speaking off the top and you were talking about the casual acceptance of the gay character in this movie, where it was just matter-of-factly done and it wasn't an issue, wasn't a problem, all that sort of stuff. Obviously, it sort of falls into the stereotype of gay best friend later on. But, I think on the surface, it's clearly a very well-intentioned move and a smart move by Heckerling to make something that sort of seems like it's going to become a mountain, but ends up being a bit of a molehill instead.
Yeah, I mean, and it's based on, I think his name is Frank Christian in Emma, who she is in love with, or she thinks she's in love with, and it turns out he's been secretly engaged the entire time. So the modern version of him having been completely unavailable to her in a way that she didn't realize it was that he's gay. I am very fortunate in that I was not in like any kind of threatening friend group when I was a teenager. I had basically had friends who were waiting for me to say it first before they were willing to talk about it. So it's not like I needed a movie to soothe me in any way to make me feel safer in some way, because I felt pretty safe as it was. But it made such an impression on me the first time I saw this movie that when she finds out, oh my God, he's been gay this whole time, it's not about him having been duplicitous in any way. It's about her having been a bonehead. So she's not approaching it from the point of view that I'm normal and I'm doing everything right and this guy screwed me over. It's that, oh my God, I can't believe that I thought I was into this guy, but I wasn't really looking at him for who he really was. That's a really, really respectful way for the character to behave, in a way that, for many reasons, I was not expecting and not used to. Particularly, teen movies were, I grew up on them. They were just the most toxic stuff that anyone had to grow up with. It's no wonder my entire generation are all completely traumatized, because we saw this world that we were supposed to eventually fit into, of like, you were either a hot girl or a jock guy, and everything else was like pushed off a cliff into a lake of fire. I mean, the stakes were so high in teen movies for acceptance. Gays were particularly the butt of, gay men especially were the butt of jokes in those movies, in more ways than in any other kind of film. So particularly for it to be in a teen movie, that she finds out that he's gay, and it's all about her not having paid attention, while as he is actually, for lack of a better term, a normal person, and who's, part of a normal society. That made a huge impression on me, despite the fact that, like, we never really get to know him all that well. He's not someone that anyone wants to be. I mean, that whole kind of like Rat Pack style that he's got is not something I ever aspired to. It's very West Coast gay guy. But he's so funny, and we're also not supposed to get to know him all that well, because he's a device. He's not supposed to be a real person. So I don't have a problem with that. I just mean that it didn't hit me somewhere deep and emotional just because I love that character in some way. I just loved that having a gay friend was a normal thing, because in movies it never was.
Yeah. And he also gets this great moment, this character, to sort of also be a bit of a hero at the same time, because there's a scene near the end of the movie after we learn that he's gay, and Sharon, this Elton character at the mall, and Brittany Murphy's character is kind of being assaulted a little bit by two men, and he runs up and like pushes them away and grabs her and walks away. And, a normal movie, the next scene would have been a hate crime being committed against him, but it's not. It's just, he gets the hero moment. And that's the impression that we're left with.
Yeah, which is also directly adapted from Emma. There's a part where Harriet, I think is her name, is attacked by, again, for lack of a better term, gypsies by the side of the road, and Frank Churchill saves her. I also love, the scene where he brings over Some Like It Hot and Sporadicus for them to watch, which is supposed to, is also showing, the movie lays the clues out pretty bare, even though I was young enough that it was still a surprise to me when we find out, but that's, Amy Heckerling having a good time with her audience. And even the way he reacts when Cher's trying to get cozy with him, and he's just like, oh, I think she doesn't know what's going on here. And that he politely leaves without like freaking out, or, cause he kind of, he loves her and feels bad for her and wants to stay friends. I mean, the whole thing, there's so much affection at the same time that the humor is so cutting and witty in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Rewatching it in today's lens, from the very first scene, you can tell that something is different about this character, and you realize pretty early on that he's definitely a gay man. And, by the time you get to the scene of him being like, "We're doing a Tony Curtis double feature," which made me burst out
idea
laughing.
Of someone saying, "Sit on my bed for 3 hours, 5, whatever." One movie's 3 hours, the other one's like a healthy 2 at least. While we watch these movies, Cher Horowitz watching Spartacus is one of the funniest things. And also, like, when you go back and watch it again, you notice like how he's chatting up the bartender when he takes her to that dance, and she's like, look how he doesn't talk to any other girl except for me. Yeah. It's so funny. I have seen this movie so many times and it still makes me laugh. It still takes me to such a good place.
Yeah, I was definitely curious about why you would pick this one, because it'd been probably over 15 years since I'd last seen it. I'd only ever watched it the once. Obviously, I've seen the most famous scenes over and over because they pop up so often in pop culture. But I was curious. I was like, I think there's a gay character in this, but I couldn't remember to what extent it sort of was infused into the movie's DNA.
Its contrast to the other two is that this movie is not about my world, and yet it is a movie in which I am a functioning part of someone else's world. And that made a great deal of him. That was very important to me when I was a teenager. While Jeffrey is about my world, or at least it made me realize what my world was. And even Truth or Dare is my world, because whether or not I wanted to be associated with these very scary dancers, Madonna was my world. You know, she was my soulmate as far as I was concerned. I knew exactly who she was and what made her tick, and I knew that she and I would be best friends. So that movie was my world. Whilst Clueless was not. Teenage movies were never my world. When you grow up, gay or lesbian or queer in general, you very rarely are watching movies about you. You're watching movies about other people that you're translating to be appropriate to you in some way, because you're dreaming of the male lead or whatever it is that works for you. And so to see a movie where suddenly you're a part of things, that makes at least for me at the time, it made a great impression on me.
I think, you know, the one thing that Clueless does really well that so often filmmakers sort of forget is sometimes when you make a movie hyper specific about a specific type of person or group of people or things like that, that there's actually the universality in that. And when you do something where you're trying to appeal to everyone, that's when you end up failing, because who wants to feel like they're everyone? They want to feel specific. And that's where Clueless really succeeds, is you have this very hyper specific, you know, Valley Girl sort of thing. But in that, we sort of see ourselves.
1000%. And I think it's because Amy Heckerling can see the good and the bad of being a Beverly Hills teen, which generally in teen movies is sold as aspirational. Most teen movies are set in California just because it's just cheaper to, you know, to be open about where you're filming as opposed to faking it being somewhere else. And so as a result, California teen is seen as like the thing everyone wants to be. And what she presents it as is not something negative, but she makes it clear that it's its own world with its own rules. That you've got to play by, which is also very true to Jane Austen's Emma. So you don't necessarily watch these people enviably, and you don't look down on them either. You're just like, that's that world. That's how they operate. I don't live that way. I don't have skis to donate to the Pismo Beach disaster, you know, or where everyone lives in a mansion and, you know, all that stuff. So,
and what was it? I think it was it Dion's line? I'm pretty sure, where she said, I've never had straight friends. No, it was Ty's line. I've never had straight friends before.
And they don't know what she's talking about because they're not drug culture, which I think would be very different with Beverly Hills teens now, or maybe even at the time it was not. That was sort of Amy Heckerling being naive, but it is very funny that they don't quite get her because she's like the rough New Yorker. And, you know, by the way, rest in peace, Brittany Murphy. It's so lovely to remember her at her, you know, her dewiest and at the beginning of what was a very tragically short career. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. I one little touch I really appreciate was how it seemed like every scene, more and more girls in the background had bandages on their noses from getting nose jobs. Which it was just like little touches like that, where it almost felt like that was something from like Not Another Teen Movie sort of thing that they would do.
Totally.
In this, you get that everyone getting rhinoplasty, where like it sort of makes sense. Yeah, they're all their parents are lawyers and doctors and work in the film industry or things like that. So they all are rich, and for their 16th birthday, daddy buys them a nose job.
For their 16th birthday, or it's a spring break thing. I have a feeling that joke is probably because they all do it around the same time, like centered around a certain school holiday.
Yeah, you get a week off so no one sees all the bruising on your face.
Absolutely.
And also, there's so many tattoos on these teenagers, which I think more had to do with the fact that they didn't care about covering up the tattoos on their, you know, mid-20s actors than anything.
Yeah, there's just, I mean, again, Clueless is another one. I could just talk about that movie for hours. I think it's so great. When she says, Ty, how old are you? She's like, I'll be 16 in May. Well, my birthday's in April. And as someone older, can I give you a word of advice? And like the seriousness with which she delivers that line, it's so funny. It is so funny.
Yeah. Yeah. This movie is infinitely quotable.
Without a doubt.
All right. I think, you know, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. You know, the subject of this episode is good gay movies, and obviously we talked about 3 influential ones. I'd love if there's any others that sort of pop in your head to sort of counteract the normally not so great ones you cover hilariously on your podcast that you want to mention.
Thank you for the shout out. Yeah, there's definitely a lot, especially from around the world, and especially from Latin America. A favorite director of mine is a guy named Marco Berger from Berger from Argentina. He made a film called Plan B that's about two straight guys who fall in love. And as ridiculous as that premise sounds, or maybe not, I don't know. It's a magnificent film for the way this extreme premise is dealt with so naturally and so charmingly. But I've liked all of his films that I've seen to varying degrees. He also did one called The Blonde One, Un Rubio, which I liked, and a movie called Taekwondo. Hawaii is also a very good film of his. I just suggest, especially people who want to watch gorgeous gay men in movies, I highly suggest his films. There's also a film from, I believe, also Argentina called End of the Century from 2019, Fin de Siglo, by Lucio Castro, which is a really, really great sexy movie. One of my favorites would be Stranger by the Lake by Alain Guiraudy from France. That's the sexiest movie ever made, and absolutely filthy, but also like Hitchcockian level control of style and content and intensity. And what was the other one I was just thinking of? Oh, and Weekend by Andrew Haig, which, depending on when you release this, is about to be screened at the Paradise, which is also a really wonderful, sort of like a gay Lost in Translation.
Well, excellent. That is a very comprehensive watch list for anyone that's looking for some modern queer films for people to check out. So I really appreciate you name dropping all of those there, Bill.
Yes, and then of course there's other movies that involve more of the spectrum than just gay men, but I don't care about those. So
that's the Bill we know and love.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, I really appreciate you coming on today. It's a pleasure. I learned a lot from you, and watching these three movies was a real treat.
Well, I've always said I love every time you ask me, I'm always happy to do it. So thank you for letting me come on here and, as always, ramble on for far too long.
No, it's all good. Now, I know that currently your podcast, BGM, Bad Gay Movies, is on a hiatus. You just finished your latest season.
That's right.
What is the plan for the show?
We will come back. I'll be recording episodes over the summer. I am collecting my list of guests right now for the next season, and episodes should return in September.
Nice. Well, I'm very excited for that. You had some really interesting guests and hilarious episodes on this latest season. I was very happy to see that you did The Last of Sheila, because that was a movie I only watched like less than 2 months ago. And then it was like a few weeks later, you did a podcast about it, and that made me very excited.
Baum,
and more excited. I was actually a little worried. I was like, oh no, did Bill and his guest hate this movie? And then I listened to the episode, and you're both like, this is probably the best movie we've ever covered.
Yeah, it's a good gay movie. I like them. I'd never seen it before. It was Matt's suggestion for the show, and he wanted to do it. And I was, I'm happy to let my guests choose, provided that the film is in some way relevant. And it is. It's a really good movie. It's a 70s movie that is kind of like tacky enough to be on our show. But I'm not sorry. If we watch something for the show and I like it, I'm not afraid to say so. I'm not going to be shitty on something on purpose. Although we also will return to the kind of sort of grungy, low budget nonsense that we covered a lot more of in the past. Things have just changed because, in the past I did the show solely with Mike and Dan. But it's been 10 years and our lives are busier and they're different. And I like to keep the show going. And it didn't make us rich enough to quit our day jobs. So I grab them whenever they're available, and I'm grateful for the time that I do have with them, but they're busier. And so it just means the show had to change. Yeah.
Very nice. Well, where can people find you and your show, and what's the best way to
The podcast is anywhere that you can find podcasts. Just look up Bad Gay Movies, Bitchy Gay Men. And I am on the socials just under my name at Bil Antoniou, Bill with one L, on Twitter and Instagram.
Well, I'll make sure to link to the show and to your account in the show notes, as always, for people to check that out and give you a follow, because you are also an excellent Twitter follow as well.
Thank you very much. And then also, I always forget to mention thatshelf.com, which our podcasts are both on, and I have the Criterion shelf on there that people can read, including the upcoming Pride column that I think you're contributing to. Did I see you sign up for something?
Yes, I signed up for 2 things. Right. Hopefully I can watch them and get them into you in time.
You'll be fine. Don't worry.
But as a great transition there, this has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. Do you have any favorite gay or queer films? Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music, and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.